Hey, seventh grade. Um, Today we're going to be learning about the impact of the Spanish Inquisition. Sorry, not the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and then we're going to learn about the Spanish Inquisition later in a future lesson. But no, today we're going to talk about the effects of the Crusades. Um, and one of the effects that nobody really talks about very much is the introduction of South Asian spices into Europe. Right? And this is going to be a really big deal because it's going to completely change the European diet. It's going to make meat a lot more accessible to Europeans because spices allow meat to be preserved for longer periods of time. Remember, this is a period of time when nobody has a freezer, right, or a refrigerator. Right? So if you're in a warmer climate in Europe, your access to meat might be good, but you're not going to be able to preserve that meat for long. But the introduction of spices allows you to treat meat in a way that's going to protect the meat from bacteria and basically going bad for a longer period of time. So, with that in mind, here's a few spices jokes for you. What's the devil's favorite spice? Cinnamon. Why did the spice get bullied? Because he's ginger. I was in my mom's kitchen the other day and I switched all the spices on her labels. I'm not in trouble yet, but the thyme is cumin. Oh, I could go all day with those. Those ones are good. All right. Let's wrap up the Crusades. Remember, there's 5 different Crusades we talked about. The first Crusade is really the only one that had any modicum of success. They recaptured the Holy Land for 50 years, but then lost it again. One of the reasons that I say it was only a moderate success, though, is because the First Crusades left a big wake of violence behind them. So basically, wherever the Crusaders moved, there was a lot of persecution along the way. Persecution, particularly of Jewish people, Jews in the Middle East, suffered under the Crusaders. All right. So ultimately, the Crusades failed in their mission, which was to capture the Holy Land and incorporate it into Christendom. The Holy Land would never, ever actually belong to Christendom for the rest of history. But even though the Crusaders failed, there were some positive consequences for Europe. Right? So probably the biggest positive consequence is it opened Europe up to the rest of the world. Europeans had access to Asia and Africa and the Middle East through trade and travel. The Mediterranean once again became a hotbed for intercontinental trade. So with trade comes the introduction of new products, new materials into Europe that hadn't previously existed. So the Crusaders introduced things like silk into Europe and also spices. Right? I just talked about why spices were important. There's also a lot of other products and inventions that were brought into Europe that had never been seen before. The Crusades also encouraged exploration. They stirred up a sense of adventure in the European imagination, and they made Europeans curious about what existed in East Asia, for example, what existed in Central and Southern Africa, for example, and of course, most importantly, what existed, if anything, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Right? Remember, the Crusades occurred in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. The last crusade ended about 75 years before Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World. So a lot of historians, rightly, I think, believe that without the Crusades, exploration of the New World would have been delayed by a few more centuries. Right? So the Crusades opened up European exploration to exploring the world. And then, of course, Crusades, even though they caused a lot of damage in other parts of the world, they did also bring a lot of European benefits to other parts of the world. So European ideas about politics and religion, Christianity, law, philosophy, art, science, mathematics began to spread for the first time outside Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Remember, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it did so in a very violent, fiery way. A lot of the achievements of the Roman Empire that were not intentionally preserved were basically burned away and lost forever, except for in Europe, because the Catholic Church decided to make an effort to preserve as much of the Roman Empire's achievements as much as possible in the monasteries of Europe. Right, so the Crusades kind of re-injected the rest of the world with European ideas that they inherited from the Roman Empire. All right. Now let's talk about some negative effects. One of the most impactful consequences of the Crusades was a dramatic rise in religious persecution against non-Christians inside of Europe, and also heretics. Right? So remember, non-Christians are people who are not baptized. So at this time, these would be Jews and Muslims in Europe. Heretics are baptized Christians who reject church teachings on certain important issues. Right? So religious persecutions against these two groups spiked dramatically after the Crusades. This is primarily because there's a lot of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment that rises up in Europe after the failure of the Crusades. So why is this? Well, the Crusades made Islam the number one enemy of Christendom. Right? Europeans believed that the fact that the Muslims were controlling Jerusalem was offensive to God and was a terrible injustice. Right? So a lot of Christians thought, well, if we can't recapture Jerusalem, maybe the best thing we can do is just drive Muslims out of Europe. Right? They saw Islam as a disease that needed to be removed from Europe permanently. Right? They thought this is the best thing that could be done. All right, then within Europe itself, the other main target of Christianity, like I said, were the Jews, right? So just like the Muslims, Jews were viewed as enemies of God, the murderers of Christ, who needed to be driven away from Europe. And then I said the second group, so non-Christians, and the second group is heresy. So heresy is a term that refers to teachings about faith or morals that violate church doctrine, right? From people inside of Christianity. Okay, so people outside of Christianity, like a Jewish person or a Muslim person, couldn't be a heretic, but a Christian who rejects the divinity of Christ, for example, would be. Okay, so yeah, they saw heretics as a particular threat, not only to the church itself, but also to human souls in general. And so the Crusades had the effect of making the Catholic Church a lot more powerful. And so heresy became a much more significant threat, because it wasn't only a threat to the teaching authority of the church, but also to political authority itself. Remember, when the Holy Roman Emperor crowned Charlemagne, he essentially created a unity between the secular political world and the religious world of the Catholic Church. Right? So an attack on the Catholic Church in the form of a heresy is also going to be perceived as an attack on political authority. So non-Christians and heretics were all seen as threats, not only to the church, but to political institutions. All right. So So yeah, even though the basic point here is there's a lot of positive and negative effects of the Crusades, your book is going to focus mostly on the negative effects, which is fine. So that's what I'll do. Let's talk about the Jews for a second. So the Jews inside of Europe were the main target. This is because Muslims inside of Europe were mostly located in Spain. And the story of what happens in Spain is a little bit different from the rest of Europe. Um, in southern, central, and northern Europe, the main continent, the main body of the continent, the only non-Christians that really exist there now are Jews. So many Europeans saw Jews as enemies of the church, and they said, well, Crusades are an attempt to destroy the enemies of the church, so therefore we should use the Crusades to terrorize Jews. So in the first Crusade, for example, knights would travel around and kill Jewish families, so much so that it's estimated that a few thousand Jewish families actually committed murder-suicide to escape the terror they were facing, right? Um, Angry mobs would travel around Europe and actually, or European villages, and they would hunt Jewish people. They would execute them. Um, so yeah, basically Europe became a really, really, really bad place for the Jews during and after the Crusades. Now, while there were several church members, Catholics, who did try to protect the Jews, in general, this was not the case. Entire countries like England and France passed laws that banished Jews from their country. So Jews were no longer welcome in England and France. Um, One reason they were able to do this legally is because of something called usury. So usury is basically the practice of collecting interest on a loan. So if Jerry decides to lend $100 to Sebastian, when Sebastian pays Jerry back, Jerry could actually tell Sebastian he owes him more than $100 now. Because when you loan $100 to someone, not only are you giving them $100, you're also giving up the opportunity to spend that $100. So usury is basically interest on a loan. So when Sebastian pays Jerry back, maybe instead of paying him $100, he has to pay him $105. Well, at the time, the church saw this type of lending practice as a sin, right? It was forbidden by church law. If you lend money to someone, you are not allowed to charge interest on the loan. Jews, on the other hand, had no such laws. They practiced usury openly, right? And because they were practicing usury, they were able to take advantage of market systems. And so they became wealthier at a faster rate than Christian merchants did, right? And so this was used as a legal excuse to get the Jews out of England. So in 1290, King Edward I of England said that because Jews practice usury, Jews are not allowed in England. And he actually pushed to kick them out of Europe entirely. Basically, he created a law. He said when they're leaving, they are allowed to keep anything they can carry. Everything else now belongs to me, to the crown, right? So this instantly impoverished and made homeless all the Jews inside of England. The Jews had to get out, or they could convert. It was up to them. Most chose to get out. All right, we're going to stop there. Tomorrow we will talk about the Inquisition and Spain. All right, have a good